Good evening and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum. My name is Bill McNally and I'm president of the Forum's Board of Directors. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to take just a moment to say a few words about our organization. Those of you who have joined the Ford Hall Forum as supporting members have helped us to maintain our commitment to the spirit of debate and inquiry. To those of you who are joining us tonight for the first time or have not yet had the opportunity to become members, I'd like to extend to you an invitation to take an active part in the Forum's long-standing tradition. Since 1908, the Ford Hall has been bringing speakers of national and international renown to Boston in the interest of free speech and constructive dialogue. We depend on you, the public, to help us with this endeavor. You may ask, what's the value of a public forum in today's world? In a world of ever-growing webs, nets, and cables, the forum retains a unique claim to a space that both permits and preserves face-to-face discussion that explores an immediate rather than a virtual reality. As you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider the ways in which you can help keep this space free and accessible to you, our audience. By becoming a member or by filling out our audience survey form, you letting us know that you value the forum and how we can best and letting us know how we can best address your interests in the future. Ultimately, you determine the success of the forum, a cultural institution that derives its lasting power from public enthusiasm and tangible support. And now on to this evening's speaker. I'm pleased to introduce to you a person named by Time magazine as one of the 50 future leaders of America, under 40. I don't know quite why they have that tagline on there. His name is Ralph Reed, and he has indeed led the Christian Coalition to increased importance within the American political scene, garnering for it a membership of 1.7 million since he founded it just in 1989. His extensive background in politics includes 4 presidential campaigns and over a dozen statewide contests. His views and those of the coalition he heads have assumed a level of importance within American politics at both the national and state levels, which many would not have predicted. Mr. Reed has also served as executive director of the College Republican National Committee, and he founded Students for America. He is also the author of 2 books, Active Faith, which argues that religious faith is essential to democracy, and Politically Incorrect, the emerging faith factor in American politics. His columns have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, National Review, and Policy Review. He's appeared on ABC Nightline, This Week with David Brinkley, Larry King Live, and Meet the Press, among many other television programs. We welcome him to the forum this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Ralph Reed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate that very generous introduction and that warm welcome, and it's great to be back in Boston. I've heard rumor that you have a rather exciting Senate race up here, and I understand that they're going to be debating here, I believe, in Faneuil Hall next week, and I'm privileged and honored to be in this hall, which is so steeped in the history of our country and in the history of the experiment that we call American democracy. This has been a rather tough 24 hours for me. I had to sit in Atlanta yesterday and see the Atlanta Braves lose to a team called the Yankees. And then I came to Boston this morning, and when my car pulled up to the luncheon that I spoke at, I looked out and it was Union Club. So this has been a tough time for me, but I'm glad to be here. I don't know how many of you all noticed it or not, but did you notice that when the Pope came to New York City last year, that when he got to LaGuardia, he didn't get down and kiss the ground? I don't know if anybody else noticed that, but I noticed that. And I asked a good friend of mine why the Pope didn't kiss the ground, as I have often seen seen him do when he arrives somewhere. And my friend, who's Roman Catholic, informed me of something I'd never heard before, which is the Pope only kisses the ground under two circumstances when he arrives somewhere. Either A, if he has never been to that country before, or B, if he flew in on U.S. Air. Those are the only two circumstances. I flew in on Delta, so I am here, and I look forward to sharing tonight a little bit about what I think these elections 12 days from tonight are about, a little bit about the role of religious conservatives in those elections, and something about what I think the future of our politics holds with regard to the mixture of religion and politics. A controversial mixture, but one that I think is not only part of what's right with America, I believe it is a tradition as old as our democracy itself. We are here, of course, 12 days before the last presidential election of this decade, the last election of this century, and indeed, for the first time since the first Europeans landed on this continent 400 years ago, the last election of a millennium. And so we choose not only the leaders for the next century, we choose the leaders for the third millennium. That is a unique moment in the history of our country. And if you look back at the history of America, it is the last election of a century that always sets the tone and the priorities for the coming century. In 1796, for example, George Washington, after having been elected unanimously in the Electoral College twice before, was begged and urged to run another time for a third term. And George Washington said to those who urged him to do that, "We just fought a bloody war that we would no longer have to serve under a long-serving, that we would no longer have to live under a long-serving regent." And so he, imitating the example of Cicero, laid down the scepter and took up the plow and returned to private life, setting a moral example that was so compelling that every president for the next 150 years voluntarily retired after serving only 2 terms because of the example that Washington had set. And of course, as soon as we had a president who did serve more than 2 terms, we amended the Constitution to ensure that it would never happen again. By the way, that example of leaving public life after a relatively short period of service and returning back to private life to live under the laws that they've been passing for everybody else is an example that many of our politicians today would do well to emulate. 1896, of course, you had the great election between William Jennings Bryan, the golden-tongued prairie warrior, and William McKinley, the conservative Republican whose running mate was Theodore Roosevelt. McKinley, of course, had a very backwards-looking, inward-turning view of America as it entered the Industrial Revolution. He said that he wanted to turn our cities into prairies. He wanted to move from a gold-backed currency to a silver currency and a currency even backed by crop commodities. And he wanted to nationalize the railroads, and he wanted to stop the industrialization that was making America a leader in the new capitalist order. He was also a pacifist who believed that it was wrong to build a strong military, and of course a very devout and committed Christian, as was William McKinley. And what an important election that was, because McKinley, of course, believed in a strong military, believed in the United States becoming not only a hemispheric power, but a global power, embraced the emerging order of an industrial democracy, wanted to keep the United States with money as good as gold and as sound as gold. And as we all know, within just 5 years of that election, William McKinley was tragically dead by an assassin's bullet. Theodore Roosevelt was president of the United States, the youngest man to ever occupy that office until John F. Kennedy did in 1960. He was a disciple of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great naval strategist. He was a former assistant secretary of the Navy. He built for the United States a Navy that rivaled even that of Great Britain, which up until then was the mother of the seas. And within 20 years of that election, the United States was the banking, the military, the economic, the financial, and the political capital of the entire world. And if the election had gone the other way, the future of America would have been very different. And now we face another election like that in 1996. Not a choice, as in Washington's time, between restrained government and tyrannical government. Not an election, as in Roosevelt and McKinley and William Jennings Bryan's time, between an industrial order and an agrarian order. But now a choice between how we will solve the social pathologies, the disintegration of our family, and our culture that so threatens our land. On the one hand, you have those who believe that the answer to illegitimacy, to illiteracy, to family breakup, to a coarsening of the culture, to a growing epidemic of violence and crime and drugs that has no precedent in the American experience, is one more government program, one more government agency, one more government check out of Washington, D.C. And on the other hand, you have those that our movement represents, who believe that the liberal welfare state has had its chance, that those who believe that government could solve our social problems had an opportunity from 1960 to 1996 to spend in constant 1990 dollars $5.3 trillion on welfare at every level of government. More money, by the way, than was spent winning World War II, Korea, and in Vietnam combined in 1990 dollars, and they have failed, and they have failed utterly. And if liberals were right in the 1960s, and I believe they were, in saying that however noble our opposition to international communism was, that a ground war in Asia was an unsound and a failed policy, then I believe that they have to be measured by the same standard. And that is not the height of their aspirations, but the depth of their failures and the magnitude of the human casualties that have resulted, and we see those casualties all around us. There are more people living in poverty today than were living in poverty when Lyndon Baines Johnson declared the war on poverty in 1965 in a speech at the University of Michigan. And so we believe that the answer to what ails America is to shift resources away from government, which has failed to meet many of these needs, and instead rely upon the benevolence of the American people, the faith community, private charities, and local and state governments. We're not suggesting that government should not be involved. Government clearly has a role, but we believe that that role needs to be reduced. And in answer to what the problem, the solution, I should say, is, to the African-American male in the inner city who has no father, who has no home, who has no strong family, who has no education, who has no hope, in answer to the question of how can we best reach out and touch that 15 or 16-year-old child who's using drugs and sharing it with their friends, or the 15-year-old girl who's just found out that she's pregnant out of wedlock and is struggling with whether or not to keep that child or whether or not to have an abortion, in answering the question of what we can best do to reach those who have come from broken homes and who are ravaging our society with crime and with drugs, and by the way, single males disconnected from their family of origin without a stable home of a mother and a father present in the home represent only 13% of the population, but they commit 42% of the crimes, and they make up 90% of our prison populations. That gives you a feel for the vast social pathology that is out there. And we believe the answer is not another government program, another government grant, more spending out of Washington, D.C. We believe that it is men and women of faith, the decency and benevolence and generosity of the American people, once again through churches and synagogues and private charities and other efforts, reaching out and touching those who are hurting and need the healing touch of God. And so tonight, as we stand on the threshold of this 21st century, we have to ask ourselves, what is the time in which we live? Well, the truth is we live in a time of boundless opportunity. We have conquered the twin evils of fascism and communism, and we have left them in Ronald Reagan's unforgettable phrase, on the ash heap of history. For the first time in more than 45 years, we have moved beyond a constant hot or cold war that required up to 10% of our gross national product just to ensure our liberties. In the Silicon Valley in California, there are computer chips that are being developed that can process more equations in a single second than 1 billion people could process in their lifetimes. Just outside of Boston, here in this area, there are real-life television sets, actual real-life television sets that will emulate the clarity of real life and will be in just about every home in America within the space of 10 years. We are connected through a sophisticated web of technology that includes fax machines, a telecommunications revolution, satellites, and of course the burgeoning internet, which is now sweeping the country just as cable television did just 10 years ago. Today there are 12 to 15 million American households hooked up on the internet, and by the year 2000, just 4 years from now, it is estimated that there will be 50 million people on the internet. It took 86 years for the Dow Jones Industrial Average to pass the 1,000 mark. It took another 15 years for it to pass the 2,000 mark. It took 5 years after that for it to pass the 3,000 mark, and yet in only 3 additional years, just since 1993, it has shattered the 6,000 mark. And so there is no question about the fact that we stand on the threshold of what Ronald Reagan called an epic age, a time of technological splendor and of explosive human potential. And yet there is also no denying that in the midst of that epic age, in the midst of that economic bounty, and in the midst of wealth beyond the wildest dreams of human civilization, just a few decades ago, there is a great spiritual and moral unease across America. A majority of Americans tell pollsters that the country is on the wrong track, and the number one reason they cite isn't the economy stupid, to use the words of the sign that hung in the Clinton campaign headquarters in 1992. It's moral decline, it's the breakup of the family. A recent study by Fordham University, researchers at Fordham University documented this fact in terrifying detail, concluding that our social and moral well-being as a nation had plummeted to its lowest level in 25 years. And they used a series of indices. Just like we have a leading index of economic indicators, they looked at the leading index of social and moral indicators. And 6 out of the 7 indicators were on the way up, and 5 of the 6 of them were at the highest levels ever recorded. Teen pregnancy, teen suicide, drug use, child abuse, crime, family disintegration, illegitimacy, illiteracy, in each instance rising at historic levels. And there is no denying the fact that money alone is not the answer to these problems as we prepare for the 21st century. If we live in a society where we have cities with skyscrapers of silver and streets paved with gold, but our children are killing one another, 1 out of every 2 marriages ends in divorce, 1 out of every 3 children born in America is born out of wedlock, never knowing a father, many of them never knowing anyone who has a father. 1 out of every 4 students who walks across a graduation stage next spring will not be able to read the diploma that they were just handed. They'll be functionally illiterate. There are 90 million Americans who are functionally illiterate, can't fill out a job application, can't read a newspaper at the 6th grade level. And an African American male in the inner cities of America, from Detroit to South Central to Washington, D.C., has a higher likelihood of being killed before the age of 35 than an American soldier did in Vietnam. That is the kind of social pathology that we suffer from, and the amazing thing to me is that gazing out over that scale of human casualties, there are still people who would honestly tell you that the most dangerous thing that could happen in America is for people with faith in God to get involved in our political process. My friends, we don't need fewer people with faith in God involved in politics. We need more. I believe that they hold one of the keys to our future. And if in the 20th century, the two large issues, the two big questions that occupied most of our time and most of our political debates were first, economic prosperity, how to create it, how to sustain it, and how to extend it to those who had been left behind. That was issue number one. And issue number two was how to provide for national security against foreign aggression and foreign foes in wars both hot and cold. If those have been the issues of our lifetimes, then I believe the issues of the 21st century will be those of the disintegration of the family, will be those of a loss of civility and a decline in morality. And these, ladies and gentlemen, are problems of the heart, and they are problems of the soul. Listen to what Robert Kennedy said in 1968 in the final weeks of his life. He said, "We seem to have surrendered excellence, the things that matter most, our values as a society, for the mere accumulation of material things. The gross national product," he went on to say, "does not account for the health of our children, for the joy of their play, or for the quality of their education. It does not account for the beauty of our poetry, for the strength of our marriages, for the intelligence of our public debates, or for the integrity of our public officials." And you think about the time in which he spoke. Again, a time of tremendous economic prosperity, but also a time when people of faith, mostly on the left rather than on the right, but people of faith confronted what they believed to be grave evils and injustices in the area of poverty in the inner city, in the area of urban renewal, in the area of civil rights, in the area of nuclear proliferation, in the area of getting the United States out of Vietnam. And no one said that those men and women of God, like the Berrigan brothers who led anti-draft rallies, or Martin Luther King who led the March on Washington and did it, by the way, with buses that didn't say Greyhound or Trailways on the side of them, but said Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church on the side of them. No one said then that they violated the separation of church and state. Only today, when that kind of energy and activism is generated on the right, is it suddenly a threat to our liberties. The truth is, there's been a cruel double standard that has come crashing down that applies differently whether one is a liberal person of faith or a conservative person of faith. Well, these are the facts. The facts are that if we were to shout and bludgeon and intimidate people with faith in God into silence so that they were not involved in our political process, you would have to take an X-Acto knife to the history books of America, including the history that transpired in this very hall 200 years ago, and you would have to remove it from the cherished history of our nation. Because the Revolutionary War began, as historian Alan Heimert has correctly pointed out, because of what he calls the black regiment of the evangelical clergy, which prepared the evangelical mind for the idea that Great Britain had become immoral and corrupt and venal and had drifted away from God, and that the United States needed to become, in John Winthrop's words, a city on a hill, a shining example to the rest of the world, a moral and a righteous nation, a nation, by the way, where some revolutionary pamphleteers based right here in Boston believed would be where Christ would rule and reign during his millennial reign. And if you've never read Bernard Bailyn's Pulitzer Prize-winning Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, I urge you to read it, because he points out that without those sermons, without the evangelical church, without the First Great Awakening, which converted tens of thousands of people between 1740 and 1760, he points out that those were the true ideological origins of the American Revolution. You see, it wasn't just about whether or not it was lawful or not to pay taxes to a government without representation. It was about whether or not a government, in the words of Jefferson, treated its citizens as men and women made in the image of God, endowed by that God with certain inalienable rights, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Fast forward to the anti-slavery movement. Again, which swept much of this part of the country during the 1830s when Charles Grandison Finney preached some of the most uproarious revivals that have ever been seen in the history of Western civilization. It has been estimated by historian Whitney Cross that 100,000 people made professions of faith in Christ in the space of an 18-month period alone. In fact, in upstate New York, where Finney went from town to town and hamlet to hamlet, the revivals became so fierce and so strong, and the flames of revival burned so bright that that part of the country was referred to as the burned over district. And after those revivals, what happened? Houses of prostitution were boarded up, saloons and tippling joints closed, labor and management disputes melted away, church attendance skyrocketed, alcoholism and pauperism and other social diseases and ills disappeared. And let me tell you what else happened. A lot of people joined the anti-slavery movement and later the nascent Republican Party. And when people say today that conservative evangelicals are, quote, taking over the Republican Party because they're participating in its platform debates and are delegates at its national conventions, I would remind them that the first Republican platform committee that ever sat in Chicago in 1856 was a platform committee dominated by anti-slavery evangelicals who wrote into that platform a condemnation of the institution of slavery, not just as an inefficient labor formula or as an unfair economic system, but as, in their words, a grave evil and a national sin. And so throughout history, whether from the left or from the right, whether the anti-slavery movement or the revolutionary struggle, whether the civil rights movement or the temperance movement or the suffragist movement, every great social reform movement in the history of the United States has been birthed in the churches. It has been cradled in revivalism. It is poured out of the pews and into the precincts, and thank God, because had it not been for those movements, including the movement that I represent today, there would be certain issues that we would have to confront as a society that would be ignored. You know, I support a 15% tax cut. I believe the American people are overtaxed. I think the American family is the most overtaxed institution in America today. The average family of four pays 24% of its income in federal taxes, and if you add in state and local taxes and sales taxes and ad valorem and property taxes, that figure rises to 38%. They're paying more in taxes than they spend on food, medicine, clothing, and housing combined. And so I favor a $500 per child tax credit to try and relieve the crushing tax burden on the American family. The president says he favors a tax credit as well, but when he was presented with a budget that would have given that tax credit, he vetoed it twice, and his own tax credit only applies to children under the age of 13. Now, I don't have a 13-year-old yet, thank goodness. I have a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 3-year-old, but my recollection from my own adolescence is that the greatest expenses come after the age of 13 and not from the age 12 and down. But even if we were to cut taxes on the family, even if we were to balance the budget tomorrow, even if the stock market were to break the 10,000 mark tomorrow, and we did not deal with some of these issues of the heart and soul about which I am speaking, I believe we will have failed our society and failed our children. And let me just mention just a couple of those issues. The first is the issue of the sanctity of innocent human life. This president said that he wanted to make abortion safe, legal, and rare. He was presented with a bill that would have outlawed a procedure called the partial birth abortion procedure, a procedure so horrific, so inhumane, so indefensible that the American Medical Association, Billy Graham, Pope John Paul II, the U.S. Catholic bishops, and former Surgeon General C. Everett Koop all urged the president to sign the bill outlawing that procedure. In that procedure, a child that can survive outside the womb, usually after the 7th month of pregnancy, is medically breached so that the feet and hands are delivered first rather than the head. And then after that child has been delivered 2/3 of the way down the birth canal, its mouth 4 inches away from taking its first breath. That child is systematically executed. We believe that that procedure is indefensible. 90% of the American people say that it ought to be outlawed, and yet the president vetoed that bill. We think that was a failure in moral leadership. And that, by the way, was not a partisan issue. There were 85 Democrats in the House of Representatives and at least a dozen in the Senate who voted to ban that procedure, including Patrick Kennedy, the nephew of Ted Kennedy, including David Bonnier, the number 2 ranking Democrat in the House, including Dick Gephardt, the leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. There is no reason why a bipartisan end to that procedure could not have been reached. The issue of crime and drugs. Since 1992, when Bill Clinton was elected president, drug use among 12 to 17-year-old American teens has increased 105%. It's doubled. Marijuana use is up 144%. Cocaine use is up 166%. And there are 1.2 million American teenagers who are using drugs today every single month, that were not using drugs just 4 years ago. Now, what was the president's answer to this social contagion? Midnight basketball, teen curfews, and school uniforms. Those are all good ideas, but they are no substitute for the kind of moral leadership that we need. Moral leadership that was vitiated when he appointed a Surgeon General who got up at a forum and said that we should study the legalization of drugs. Moral leadership that was vitiated when he went on MTV and when he was asked whether or not he would inhale again if he had the opportunity, he said, "Sure I would, if I could. I tried before, and I'd do it again." By the way, there was, I believe on October the 11th in the New York Times, there was a story. New York Times is hardly often viewed as a conservative newspaper with a conservative editorial policy, and they wrote a story about skyrocketing teen drug use, and they quoted one 14-year-old girl who asked why she was smoking marijuana on a daily basis, said, "The President of the United States did it, and he said it was okay. I don't know why I shouldn't be allowed to do it as well." Now, I see we have a few Clinton supporters in the audience tonight. Now, there are those who believe that people with religious faith getting involved in the political process are part of what's wrong with American politics. They have called them names such as card-carrying members of the Flat Earth Society. One columnist compared them to, and I quote, "the American equivalent of Shiite Muslims, managing at a single stroke of a pen to not only offend 40 million Americans, but 100 million Muslims all over the world." And then, of course, there was the columnist who I won't name because I don't want to embarrass him, but his initials are Al Hunt with the Wall Street Journal, who actually blamed Pat Robertson for the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson in a column printed in June of last year. I promise you, I'm not making this up. And in that column, Mr. Hunt said that Pat Robertson was to blame because he had gotten on his television program and said that a family should be ordered so that a man was the head of the household and that children were to honor their parents. And according to Al, that pernicious doctrine of men being the heads of their households had been responsible throughout the centuries for spousal abuse, child molestation, and even murder in the case of Nicole Brown Simpson. Of course, what Al Hunt did not finish quoting was the rest of the verse that Pat Robertson was quoting on the air, which, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 11 and continuing. And in that chapter, the Apostle Paul says, "A man shall love his wife as Christ loved the church, even being willing to lay down his life for her." You see, Christianity doesn't teach that men should be allowed to abuse their wives, and their children. It teaches the opposite. It teaches that they should be willing to lay down their lives in defense of their wives and children. And 30 years ago, the last time an issue of religion and politics was raised, it wasn't raised against religious conservatives in the Republican Party. It was raised against a Roman Catholic in the Democratic Party, John F. Kennedy. And there were those who said that John F. Kennedy shouldn't be president because he was Catholic, because he might take orders from the Pope. There was even one brochure that was distributed that said that a tunnel was being dug between the White House and the Vatican so that people could dispatch messages back and forth. And in the midst of that campaign, John F. Kennedy delivered a speech that I believe is one of the most eloquent speeches ever given by a presidential candidate of either party on September the 11th, 1960, before the Houston Ministerial Association. And Kennedy said this. He said, if 40 million Americans have lost their right to be president on the day that they were baptized, then not only am I the loser, but this entire nation is the loser in the eyes of history and in the eyes of the world. And he went on to say there should be only one issue in this campaign, and that is not what kind of church I believe in, for that should matter only to me. The only issue in this campaign should be what kind of America I believe in. I believe he was right. I believe to oppose him as a candidate because of his Roman Catholicism was bigotry, and I believe those who have opposed evangelicals and Catholics in our own time because of their concerns about these moral issues often veers into bigotry. And so the question is, what kind of America do these men and women of faith believe in? They believe in an America in which the budget is balanced. They believe in an America with term limits so that men and women of public service rotate frequently out of office and return to the communities from whence they came. They believe in an America with tougher laws against crime and drugs so that someone like Richard Allen Davis, who brutally murdered 12-year-old Polly Klaas, abducted her from her bedroom during a slumber party while her mother slept right next door. Richard Allen Davis had been let out just a few months before after serving only 5 years of a 15-year sentence for kidnapping and molesting someone else. And if we had the kind of America that we believe in, Polly Klaas would be alive tonight because Richard Allen Davis would have never been let out of prison in the first place. Let me close by quoting Winston Churchill, who I believe was the best friend this country ever had. He said, the American people always do the right thing after they have exhausted every other possibility. And over the last 30 years, we have exhausted just about every other possibility. We have tried to fill that void that is in every person's life that Pascal called the God-shaped vacuum that is in every person's soul. We've tried to fill it with drugs and with alcohol. We've tried to fill it with material success. We've tried to fill it with fame and with fortune and with keeping up with the Joneses. And what we've discovered is that this is the most religious nation, apart from Israel, that the world has ever seen. And there is only one answer to what ails America, and that isn't just electing one candidate over another or replacing one political party with another. It is a moral and spiritual renewal that takes place in our homes, in our personal lives, in our churches, and in our synagogues. I believe that renewal is underway, and I believe it is affecting our politics for good and not for evil. And whether one means the movement that I represent, good or ill, you better get used to us because we're going to be around for a long, long time. Thank you very much.
One of the great traditions of the Ford Hall Forum is that the speaker is subjected to questions from the general public. And these are questions to which he is subjected after his speech concludes, which is where we are now. Would like to keep your questions short and concise. Please don't make your own speech. Ask your questions, and please proceed. We'll come to the center microphone here, and you sir, begin.
Many Christians believe that in the last days there will be a one-world government over which the Antichrist will rule. Certain international treaties, such as NAFTA and GATT, will certainly lead to a greater integration of the world economy, which will certainly lead to such a world government. The Christian Coalition has apparently made a litmus test of the abortion issue, which candidate Dole has felt it necessary to accede to. Unfortunately, Dole has supported the NAFTA and GATT treaties, which will lead to a world situation that certainly members of the Christian Coalition must realize will be disastrous from an eschatological perspective. Why hasn't the Christian Coalition similarly made the further internationalization of the world economy a litmus test like abortion? Why has the Christian Coalition virtually ignored this issue and not pressed its members to accept only those candidates who oppose such treaties as NAFTA and GATT?
Okay, thank you for the question. Subsequent speakers, please don't hold the microphone because I'm informed that your question doesn't get properly recorded.
Well, the Christian Coalition has only one litmus test, and that is whether or not a given candidate of either political party supports the Constitution of the United States, believes in the Bill of Rights, and believes that the government ought to strengthen the family unit rather than undermine the values that we're trying to teach in our homes and celebrate in our houses of worship. Having said that, on the issue of GATT and NAFTA and other such international and multilateral economic agreements, I think it's fair to say that in the religious conservative community, there is a diversity of views on those issues. To be sure, in parts of the Rust Belt, in the Midwest, in some parts of the South, such as Louisiana, that have suffered terrific job losses in recent years because of a loss of manufacturing enterprises, there is less support for things such as GATT and NAFTA and the World Trade Organization and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that, again, in the Silicon Valley, to which I alluded earlier, in Texas, which is very much a pro-free trade state where religious conservatives who had been elected to office, including Majority Whip Tom DeLay, who is a very committed man of faith, number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives, supported GATT and NAFTA. In South Carolina, for example, in the downstate, there is less support for those kinds of free trade agreements, but in the northern part of the state, which is not far from where I grew up along the Georgia and South Carolina border. There are high-tech firms, there are small businesses, there are BMW plants, and there are other foreign enterprises that have come in to the United States to create jobs. So it wouldn't be fair to say that the religious conservative community has one single view of those kinds of treaties and issues. That, by the way, is why the Christian Coalition did not take a position on the ratification of either GATT or NAFTA, because of that diversity of views. I will say this, with regard to foreign policy, there are two key issues in the post-Cold War era. Of course, during the Cold War, the major driving foreign policy issue for religious conservatives, as I believe it was for most Americans, was how to first contain the spread of communism, and secondly, how to transcend it by hopefully having democratic capitalism and liberty break out around the world. In the post-Cold War period, we have been focused primarily on two foreign policy issues. First of all, the security and defending the legitimate security interests of the nation of Israel. You will not find a more pro-Israel constituency in American politics outside of the Jewish community than in the conservative evangelical community. They want to ensure, for example, that yes, the peace process moves forward, but that the peace process does not compromise the security interests of a nation that is surrounded by its foes and beset by terrorism. And if, for example, they were forced to give up the Golan Heights to Syria, which some would like to force it to do, that Syria would be able to have military installations on top of the Golan that would not only be able to bomb Jerusalem and Galilee and Judea and on into Tel Aviv, but in fact, if you stand on top of the Golan Heights, as I have done when I received a military briefing during a visit there in January of 1995, you can actually see the Mediterranean Sea on a clear day. It gives you a feel for how small and defenseless Israel really is. The second issue is ensuring that American foreign policy puts the national security interests of the United States rather than those of the United Nations first and foremost. We understand that the United Nations has a role. We have certainly supported multilateral military efforts such as those in the Gulf War and believe that in many instances they have been successful. We also believe that in many instances they've been failures, as they have been in Somalia and as they have been, we believe, in Bosnia, where we now learn that the administration, for example, did allow the Bosnian Muslims to violate the arms embargo while they were telling Congress that they weren't allowing it to go on. The UN policy, as I think you know, was to disarm both sides. There are many who felt, I happen to be one of them, that it was better to allow the Bosnian Muslims to arm themselves rather than to be defenseless, while we tried in a very, I think, failed policy to try and disarm the Serbs. So these are some of the issues: security of Israel and putting the legitimate national security interests of the United States above issues of the United Nations.
Next question, please.
Mr. Reed, do you think that George Bush represented a model of the Christian coalition?
Well, I don't think the question is so much whether or not he represented a model or not, but did he believe in the policies that we believed in? And while there were certainly issues upon which we disagreed with President Bush, such as the 1990 tax increase, when President Bush ran in 1988, he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." We believe that he should have kept that pledge, that he should not have acceded to the Democratic budget deal in 1990, raising taxes. I think there's a strong likelihood that President Bush would still be president today had he not agreed to that. Having said that, even though we disagreed on that and a few other issues, we obviously agreed with him on school choice. He presented a GI Bill for kids that would have created block grants of $1 billion to those areas, particularly in poorer regions in the country, in the inner cities where many schools are war zones, and provided for $1,000 scholarships for minority children to go to the school of their choice, whether it was public, private, or parochial. We supported him as he supported the sanctity of innocent human life and vetoed, for example, an attempt by the Democratic Congress to repeal the Hyde Amendment, which would have provided for taxpayer funding of abortion. And we also supported the effort in the Gulf War, where we agreed with President Bush that the security of Israel and peace and stability in the Middle East depended upon disarming Saddam Hussein. So there were agreements and there were disagreements. I don't think there's ever going to be unanimity with anybody.
You still didn't answer my question. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Pat Robertson, founder of your organization, has said repeatedly that Hindus and Muslims are not qualified to govern in this country. With JFK's reference to Catholics being disqualified upon baptism and his rejection of that, you agree with Pat Robertson that Hindus and Muslims are not qualified to govern in this country? And I'd like to add a couple of other groups: atheists and homosexuals.
Okay. I'll start with Hindus and Muslims and move on from there. Let me first of all say that actually is not what Pat Robertson said. In 1988, he was asked who he would appoint to the cabinet, and he said, "I would appoint to my cabinet, me, if I were president, I would choose Jews and Christians because I believe they share the kind of values that I want." I don't believe that's any different than Bill Clinton saying he wants a cabinet that looks more like America and saying he wants Latinos and he wants women and he wants African Americans. And he actually had a quota appointment for Attorney General of the United States, said he would not appoint a man as Attorney General. Now, I think that we ought to have more women in the cabinet, and I think we ought to give women more opportunities to serve. And I think it's outstanding to have women serving as Attorney General or even Secretary of State. I hope we soon have a woman Secretary of State, and I think Jean Kirkpatrick would be an outstanding such person. But all Pat Robertson was saying is, this is who I would serve. This is who I would choose. He was in no way stating that anyone with a different spiritual belief or faith commitment to him was somehow not qualified to serve in government. And in fact, there have been people who didn't agree with our theology, who have been solid on the issues that we care about, that religious conservatives have supported across the country. With regard to homosexuals and atheists, I would simply cite what Martin Luther said, and that is that I would rather be operated on by a Turkish surgeon than a Christian butcher. I'm not looking for a Christian or a Jew or a person of any other faith who disagrees with me on every single issue. I would rather have someone who was an atheist or someone who didn't agree with me on my theology but did agree with me on the issues serving in government than someone who shared my faith but didn't share my politics. Because in the end, this isn't about electing someone who's a member of a particular sect or a member of a particular denomination. I've campaigned across the country, for example, for Jews, for Christians, for non-believers. I don't ask their faith. I do ask, where do you stand on the sanctity of innocent human life? Where do you stand on lowering taxes? Where do you stand on welfare reform? Where do you stand on tougher crime laws against crime and drugs? Let me close by giving a counterexample, different than the one that you asked, and that is, would we support a Christian in every instance? The answer is no. Jimmy Carter was the most explicitly evangelical presidential candidate of either political party in the 20th century, apart from William Jennings Bryan. And he was defeated by millions of votes from evangelical Christians who voted for the first divorced man to ever sit in the Oval Office, who, when he was asked the direct question, "Are you born again?" said, "We don't use that phrase in my church." So this isn't about spiritual litmus tests that either include or exclude. It's about a public policy agenda.
Next question, please.
Thank you. I'm from England, so I was particularly interested to hear what you had to say about American history this evening, and I'm very glad that next week you're coming to the Kennedy School at Harvard to speak, because I'm a student there. I'm sure many people here have heard of an organization named the Call to Renewal, which is a new organization started last year by a guy called Jim Wallis, which is for Christians in America of all denominations who want to apply their faith to politics and engage in the public square, but who don't feel comfortable with a very conservative, very Republican organization like the Christian Coalition. And I'd just like to know what your attitude is towards the Call to Renewal, whether you think there are any issues on which you could cooperate with them politically, and also whether you'd be willing to, in a forum like this, to have a public debate with Jim Wallis.
Well, yes, we would be willing to cooperate, and we think that there are some issues where we agree. Let me just cite, I'll cite quickly three that I'm aware of, and I'm sure there are others. The first is in the area of legalized gambling. We do not agree with the Republican Party or a lot of conservative Republicans on the issue of legalized gambling. We believe that legalized gambling is a cancer on our society. We believe that it is orphaning children, turning wives into widows. We believe that it's impoverishing many families. We believe further, and this is documented by a number of studies, that it doesn't create true economic growth. It creates false economic growth that deflects revenues from legitimate businesses, such as hotels and restaurants, towards casinos. There are really no new jobs when a casino comes in. What it does is it kills 1,000 jobs over here and transfers them to the gaming floor. In addition to that, of course, gaming, gambling, lotteries, pari-mutuel bettings, casinos, all other forms of legalized gambling that are proliferating across the country have been used, the excuse for it has been that we needed the revenue. Well, the problem with that is it is in effect a tax when you use it as a revenue source, and it is a tax that falls on those least able to pay. It is a regressive tax that falls mostly on poor and minorities. We know that those, for example, who buy lottery tickets and those who frequent pari-mutuel betting and those who, for example, use video poker and other video gambling things of that nature are usually people who are not wealthy, are not rich. So that would be one. And we've made it very clear that we support that. And I have to tell you, our major allies there have not been the Republican Party. Our major allies have been those on the religious left, such as the National Council of Churches. I held a news conference in Washington flanked by the chief moderator of the Presbyterian Church of America, or Presbyterian Church USA, I should say, the United Methodist Church, the National Council of Churches, and a Native American religious group. And we have worked very closely with them on that issue. The second issue is in the area of tobacco and alcohol. We do not favor President Clinton's proposal for FDA regulation of tobacco. But we do, well, I'll answer that. I'll finish answering the question if you don't mind. We do favor taking every element of President Clinton's regulatory agenda and passing it as a law through Congress. And the reason why is because we believe the Food and Drug Administration is not commissioned by Congress to regulate tobacco. We do not want the Food and Drug Administration to be diverted from its mission of ensuring that our food and our prescription drugs are safe by regulating tobacco in a way that it's not entirely clear what they would do. We think, for example, that when it comes to banning vending machines, when it comes to banning advertising directed at teenagers, when it comes to a federal law requiring a 16 or 18-year-old age before you can smoke, a federal rather than a state law, and by the way, denying federal highway funds to states that don't comply with that age limit, that could all be done by Congress. And we would support a legislative package to do that, to send it to President Clinton, and he could sign it tomorrow. And our allies, by the way, on that would be many on the religious left. Final issue that I will mention, and that is the recent rash of violence against the African American church. There have been 90 African American churches and 72 white churches that have been torched or bombed or terrorized by the forces of hatred and bigotry since early 1995. It is the greatest rash of violence against the black church since the height of the civil rights movement. We, along with the National Council of Churches and other organizations, are out there raising millions of dollars. We've raised $750,000 already and are giving that money to churches to rebuild. We also, by the way, supported a bill that would have toughened the enforcement capability of the FBI to go in and enforce those investigate those kind of bombings, because I have to say, in all truth, that many of the local law enforcement officials that were charged with investigating these acts of arson and violence were not doing so in a way that we thought was fair or speedy, and in many cases, either the pastor was being blamed or members of the church were being blamed. Some of them were being asked to take polygraph tests. I would also point out, by the way, that we were the only organization in America, in opposition from the Clinton Justice Department, I might add, to call for the firings of any BATF agent or any FBI agent that was involved in racist activities, including those off hours such as the good old boy roundup. We called on the FBI and the BATF to fire those agents instead of simply reassigning them from the church burnings to other cases as they did. So let me say this. I think there are areas of commonality. I think there are areas of agreement. And I also would say that I welcome liberal Christian organizations to this debate. We do not speak for all people of faith. We do not represent every Christian. This is not a monolithic community, and I think our entire civic discourse is better off if we have lots of different voices from the Christian community, the Jewish community, and other faith communities.
Thank you. Would you be willing to have a public debate with Jim Wallace about the areas where you actually
disagree?
Yes,
I would.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
My name's Sam Hine of the Bruderhof Communities. I'm a Christian. I'm not a conservative. I have two questions for you. The first one's for a man who couldn't be here tonight. He couldn't be here tonight because he's on death row. His name is Mumia Abu Jamal, and he writes this: "Isn't it odd that Christendom, that huge body of humankind that claims spiritual descent from the Jewish carpenter of Nazareth, claims to pray to and adore a being who was a prisoner of Roman power, an inmate on the empire's death row? That the one it considers a personification of the creator of the universe was tortured, humiliated, beaten, and crucified on a barren scrap of land on the imperial periphery at Golgotha, the place of the skull. That the majority of its adherents strenuously support the state's execution of thousands of imprisoned citizens. That the overwhelming majority of its judges, prosecutors, and lawyers, those who condemn, prosecute, and sell out the condemned, claim to be followers of the fettered, spat upon, naked God." And his question to you is, how can you as a Christian support the death penalty?
Well, first of all, there are obviously a diversity of views within the Christian community on that issue. I think it's fair to say that most conservative evangelicals support the death penalty. I think it's fair to say that many of our pro-life Roman Catholic allies oppose the death penalty because of the history of the teaching in the Roman Catholic Church, and we respect that teaching and we respect that diversity of views. Rather than speak for the Christian Coalition because of that diversity of views, let me speak for myself. The reason why I support the death penalty is because I believe that the death penalty can act as a deterrent. I also believe in a limited number of cases with strict evidence. I'm not talking about somebody being convicted based on hearsay or physical evidence alone, but in the Bible, as you may know, someone could only be put to death based on the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses. I don't know if you have to limit it to that, but certainly you shouldn't limit it to physical evidence alone. I think when someone takes the life of a child, as Richard Allen Davis did Polly Klaas, in a gruesome and brutal and indefensible and inhumane act, after having a rap sheet 9 pages long, after having gone to prison twice before on previous convictions of kidnapping and child molestation, after when he was sentenced, when he was asked whether or not he had anything to say to the court, he claimed that the last words that Polly Klaas said before he molested her and then strangled her to death were, "Please don't do me the way my father did." Now, I think that in those kinds of instances, we should make it clear that we as a society don't tolerate that kind of inhumanity, and I think the best way to do it is to make it clear that that person, under a just legal system, forfeits their own life.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Yes, the Christian Coalition and other groups on the right, like D. James Kennedy, Beverly Hayes, Concerned Women for America, and Dr. James Dobson, have expressed certain homophobia, in which they say homosexuals should not be youth leaders, Cub Scout leaders, Boy Scout leaders, school teachers, because they're after our children. Well, isn't it a fact that the responsible homosexual has his adult male lover who he cherishes and does not go after children, as the right groups tend to say?
Well, first of all, it's not even accurate to say that the Christian Coalition has taken a position that homosexuals should not be hired as teachers or of those supervising children. We've not said that. What we have said is that no one's sexual preference should be an issue in whether they're hired in those kinds of positions. What we do believe is that if they use that position to try and teach homosexuality as an accepted alternative lifestyle, to try and proselytize in the classroom in a way that we believe is contrary to the kinds of values that their parents want that public school to teach, such as we saw in New York City with the rainbow curriculum, with books such as Heather Has Two Mommies and so forth, where 5-year-olds were being taught about homosexuality. That's what we object to. So again, it's a public policy difference. It's not about the sexual preference of the individual involved. I'm not familiar with the policies of the other organizations that you mentioned, but that is certainly our policy.
Next question, please.
Yes, good evening. First off, you mentioned the murder of Polly Krause and that being gruesome and brutal. I think you're bringing it up in a political sense as equally brutal and equally gruesome. It has nothing to do with Democrat, your religion, my religion. That was a horrible act. And to try to bring that into a political forum, I think, is a really disgusting act, which gives a pretty fair indication of your actual core as a human being. Right now, at the outset of your incredibly self-serving and masturbatory diatribe, you made a reference.
The question is?
Yeah, my question is simple. You made a reference to George Washington and his voluntarily limiting his terms, and how you found this so admirable, as well as the following politicians who have governed this country in doing that. You are right now the leader of, and you can find this on a bipartisan level, agreeably one of the most politically powerful organizations in the country. However, you've been the leader of said organization for quite some time and as you closed your speech this evening, you mentioned how you're not going anywhere soon. So I guess essentially what I'm asking is, these individuals who you find so admirable, why aren't you able as a human being to try to follow in their footsteps?
Well, I think the primary reason is because I enjoy so much going to forums like this and getting questions like that. I would, if I were to give up this job, I wouldn't have that joy anymore, would I? But in all seriousness, I don't plan on being in this position forever, but I do think there's a difference between being the head of an organization, such as Martin Luther King was the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or Gloria Steinem was the head of Ms. Magazine, or Eleanor Smeal was the head of the National Organization for Women, or I'm the head of the Christian Coalition. I didn't interrupt you when you spoke, so why don't you give me an opportunity to answer? I think there's a difference between an office that is an office of public trust that uniquely belongs to the American people, but I'll deal with my own tenure when I reach 8 years, which was Washington's tenure. I've only been in the job for 7 years, so I'll wait until that time. I think that the more important issue that you have raised about Polly Klaas is whether or not it's appropriate for that to be a point of discussion. I think it's very appropriate for 2 reasons. Number one, because it is liberal early release programs that allow people like Richard Allen Davis to get out early and commit those kind of heinous crimes. And it seems to me that it is a perfectly legitimate point of discussion in a public debate whether someone believes that someone who is guilty of a violent felony should be eligible for parole or not. We don't believe that someone who is a violent felon, and I want to emphasize violent felon, we don't believe nonviolent felons should be excluded from parole. But we believe that if you are a violent felon, you've committed an armed robbery, you've committed a murder, you've committed a rape, you've committed a kidnapping, if you're sentenced to 20 years in prison, you serve 20 years, period. That's number one. Number two, the question of the death penalty came up earlier. Seems to me it's perfectly legitimate to ask whether or not one believes that in instances like this murder and like this molestation, whether or not the murderer should receive the death penalty or not. I do think it's rather interesting, the double standard, because there seems to be an objection to me raising the issue at the very moment that Bill Clinton is airing an ad with Polly Klaas's father on national television.
I wonder if I could ask if no more people add to the question line, because we're running out of time, and I want to give all the people who have been in line a chance to ask their question. Sir, would you go ahead, please?
I'm a Christian. I feel someone like you is an embarrassment to the Christian faith. If Jesus was here today, he'd probably throw you out of the temple with the rest of the money changers. Because the people like you give Christianity a bad name. I want to say, ask the question now. You claim to be against violence in the cities and against abortion, against all kinds of, the Holly Klaas thing. What about George Bush's violence against the Iraqi people 5 years ago? He slaughtered 300,000 people in the Persian Gulf War. How can you justify that as a Christian? Can you see Jesus with a machine gun in his hand? Is that what you picture of Jesus, the God of war? Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, not blessed are the war makers. And how can you support capital punishment when Jesus himself was executed on a cross by the state? I think you're a hypocrite. I think that people like you are dangerous and should not be given the power that you're getting now.
Thank you for the question.
You can't justify it. How can you justify it?
Thank you for the question.
Well, insofar as I've already answered the death penalty question, I don't think it's necessary to restate that. Let me deal with the issue of what St. Augustine called the just war theory, which is that in instances of individual affairs between Christians and those who are non-believers, we should have a pacifist philosophy. But when it comes to others whose lives who are at stake, we should be willing to lay down our lives to defend them. I don't think, for example, it's a very morally defensible philosophy to say that at a time when 12 million Jews across Europe were being herded into concentration and death camps, that we as Christians should not have been willing to arm ourselves and to go over there and to displace the Nazi regime. It seems to me that you're consigning millions of people to slaughter if you're not willing, reluctantly, but willing to take up arms in those kinds of struggles.
Next question, please.
Good evening. I've spent the last few years trying to reconcile some issues of Scripture with issues of public policy, and I've been doing so with little success. I think I might now have found the ultimate authority. So my question is, the much publicized prohibition against homosexuality, man lying with man, and so forth, I believe is from the book Leviticus. The book, the chapter that it's within is a litany of prohibitions. There's something about women not teaching men and wearing mixed fabrics and shellfish. And how have we been able to select this out and eliminate the other prohibitions? Where was there a revision? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm not the ultimate authority. And if someone were to think I was the ultimate authority, that would not only be bad politics, that'd be bad theology. I want to make it clear that our stand on these issues is not based on our theology. Our stand is based on what we think is sound public policy that will strengthen the family. For example, if one believes that homosexuality is immoral according to scriptural dictates, and it seems to me that's a perfectly legitimate conclusion for someone reading the scriptures to conclude, one must also conclude, according to the same scriptures, that adultery is immoral, that having sex before marriage is immoral, that incest is immoral, and so forth and so on. And I guess what I'm really
Women
trying to
teaching men is immoral? Wearing mixed fabrics is immoral?
No, I didn't say that.
No,
I
you
said,
didn't, but the Bible does.
if you would allow me to answer the question. What I'm indicating is that the Bible has injunctions against a large number of sexual practices. It does not single out homosexuality. There are far more injunctions in Scripture against forsaking one's spouse and committing adultery than there are to homosexuality. And yet, we live in a free society, don't we? And people make moral choices with which we disagree, including people who choose to have sex before marriage, heterosexuals, and including people who are not faithful to their spouses. Those are moral choices with which I disagree. But I don't go around legislating on the entire society every moral choice that I believe in. So what is our public policy position? It's twofold. First of all, we do not believe that sexual preference, any sexual preference, heterosexual, homosexual, or any other kind, should be treated under civil rights statutes on par with race, gender, or ethnicity, or age, or disability. And the reason why we feel that way is because we believe that it opens a Pandora's box in having to pick and choose between those sexual preferences. We believe that, that traditional civil rights law has always been based on external and immutable characteristics. And for example, a homosexual in the workforce wouldn't even be able to avail themselves of that civil rights law unless they got up and said they were a homosexual. And they may choose not to do that. So that's number one. And by the way, that's not a heterosexual or homosexual position. That's not a liberal or conservative position. Andrew Sullivan, who is the liberal homosexual former editor of the New Republic, agrees with me that we should not have call it a special right or call it a civil right, call it whatever you want to, but have that position.
This is quite a distance from this organization's position even 5 years ago.
No, that's not true. I've been here from the beginning of this organization. I was present.
I'm speaking the rhetoric. The rhetoric has changed dramatically.
No,
it's much more complicated, your explanation now. It
No,
used to be merely a biblical prohibition, and it's a literal translation of the Bible that moved the Christian Coalition forward. The rhetoric has changed amazingly in the last 5 years.
Actually, if you go back and you read my first book, Politically Incorrect, I said exactly what I've said tonight on this issue. If you read my book, Active Faith, which was out this year, I said the same thing that I've said this year. And I not only said that, but what else did I say? And I was, by the way, criticized by a lot of religious conservatives for saying it. I said that to get up and say that AIDS was God's retribution against the gay community, or calling gays perverts or other names, quote, did not reflect the full grace and mercy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I said that I rejected that as a political style. I can have my public policy views. I can have those public policy views without insulting or demonizing the moral choices that other people make with which I disagree, just as you can have moral choices different from mine without insulting or denigrating me. And that's always been the position of this organization. The other part of our public policy view is the Defense of Marriage Act, which defines marriage as a man and a woman in holy matrimony. That's our position, it's Bob Dole's position, and it's Bill Clinton's position. I think that's called consensus.
I want to point out that dialogue we've just seen evidenced is exactly what the strength of this forum is, and I applaud you all for participating in it in a responsible way. Because of time, we may not get to the end of this line, so I'm just saying that now so that the people in it understand the limitations. Sir, would you go ahead with your question?
Yeah, if I could just start by congratulating you on that slick plug in your first book, and ask
Yeah, well,
you...
believe me, it's been out of print for about 2 months, so don't worry. I'm not here to get royalties. There's no book table in the back tonight, trust me.
I can't express how disappointed I am, but back to my original question. Back to the question I wanted to ask. If God's biological laws were different originally, and you yourself one day, maybe after, I don't know, a big night, woke up, found yourself pregnant, Mr. Reed, would you then be pro-choice? Because added with your indifference to the death of babies in other countries such as Iraq, it seems like your anti-abortion stand is more of a war on women than anything else.
Is that the end of your question? That's your question?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
If
Well,
men could
let
have
me answer
babies,
it.
would abortion be a sacrament? I
Yeah,
guess
let
is
me
my
answer.
question.
Let me answer it this way. We did a survey of conservative evangelicals who go to church 4 times or more a month, which is about 25% of the entire electorate. That constituency, according to Newsweek, which is the most overwhelmingly pro-life constituency in the country, and this was a Newsweek survey done by Howard Feynman, their chief national political correspondent, is 68% female and only 32% male. The most overwhelmingly female constituency in the entire country is the pro-life constituency. That's number one. Number two, I will answer your question this way, since I think it's highly unlikely that I'm ever going to be pregnant. My wife has been pregnant 3 times. My wife is as pro-life, if not more pro-life than I am. And while I personally take the position that while I oppose abortion in the case of rape and incest,
It might
I
help
would
to
allow
picture yourself in poverty.
I would allow for exceptions in those cases. My wife's view is that the only time when an abortion is justified is when the mother's life is in danger. She's a woman. She's pro-life. I don't think this is about male or female. I don't think it's about gender. I think it's about human and civil rights.
Next question, please. Next question, please.
I want to make a comment about
Take your
cutting
hands-
off the questions.
Miss, don't touch the microphone or they won't be able to
About
record
cutting
you.
off the questions. All the questions tonight so far have been by men. And now that there are 4 women behind me and myself, I strongly recommend and urge you not to cut off the questions. Ralph, I was surprised by your response to the burnings of the black churches. And I want to say that to you. On the one hand. On the other hand, a woman dies every 3 minutes worldwide from illegal abortions. Every 3 minutes, Ralph. And when John Salvi, who said he wanted to be a Catholic priest, went into the clinics and shot down in cold blood Shannon Lowney and Leanne Nichols, I'm telling you that the blood of all those women and of Shannon Lowney and Leon Nichols is on your hands, and I accuse you of murder. Now, my questions are 3. 1, what are you going to do to get the blood off your hands? 2, where is Fort Hall Forum inviting him to come here and speak? And 3rd, the other question that gives me great delight, where are all your other audience people? You have practically no one here, and that also fills me with great joy and delight.
Well, the reason why more of our supporters aren't here is because they're busy distributing 46 million nonpartisan voter guides in churches. so that we can turn out the largest religious conservative vote in American history. And I believe we're going to succeed in that, and I think there will be a lot of surprised people on Wednesday, November 6th, and the main reason will be because of this constituency that will turn out, I estimate, between 25 and 30% of the entire electorate. Let me say this, an innocent child in the womb dies every 20 seconds. And the most common surgical procedure in America today isn't an appendectomy, and it isn't a tonsillectomy, it's an abortion. 1 out of every 3 pregnancies ends in abortion, and we believe that that is an unspeakable tragedy. And I might add, I think the bigger question is not why do I take the position I do, because I think it's pretty obvious why I take it. Because of my deep religious faith and my profound defense of human and civil rights for all Americans. But I guess the real question is, what happened to the liberals who were pro-life 25 years ago? Where are the Bobby Kennedys who once spoke more eloquently against abortion than I will ever dream of speaking against? What happened to Ted Kennedy, who in 1971 wrote a letter to a constituent and called abortion the greatest scourge on humanity apart from the threat of nuclear war? What happened to Reverend Jesse Jackson, who once accurately called abortion black genocide, pointing out that while African Americans represent only 12% of the population, they represent 30 to 50% of all the abortions? Where are the liberals who used to speak out eloquently and courageously on this issue and have now fallen silent because of the pro-abortion lobby to which they are beholden? I would also say one other thing about the violence against abortion clinics. I not only wrote in my 2 books, but I released a statement the day of the killings at the abortion clinic in Pensacola, a condemnation of that violence. And I won't quote the entire statement, but what in effect we said was that violence, to try and combat violence, was hypocrisy, and that to attempt to preserve life by taking life was an act of cowardice. So when I was asked, by the way, somebody asked me about the death penalty earlier, I think I went on one of the television shows and somebody called in and said, do you believe in the death penalty for the individual who committed this crime? And I said, absolutely. I believe the law should be applied just as equally, and we have condemned in the harshest and the most unambiguous and unequivocal of terms violence against any clinic, even though we obviously disagree with what's going on within those clinics. Why? Because as Martin Luther King taught, when you hate as your enemies hate, you not only destroy yourself, you debase your faith.
If we move efficiently, we may be able to get through the 4 remaining people. Let's see how far we get. Sir, your question.
Yeah, the first is just a quick yes or no question to Mr. Reed. If sending soldiers to Nazi Germany to prevent the Holocaust would have been appropriate at that time, was America doing the right thing last year when we sent troops to Bosnia?
Well, as I think I indicated earlier, I believe our policy has been a failure because I don't believe it would have been necessary to send troops to Bosnia had we allowed the Muslims to rearm at the levels that they should have been allowed to rearm. The Clinton administration, as you know, took the position that it was wrong to allow the Muslims to break the arms embargo and arm themselves. We now have learned that members of the Clinton administration, State Department, and Pentagon lied under oath and misled congressional investigators, and Henry Hyde of the House Judiciary Committee has asked for some of those who testified to be turned over to the Justice Department for possible conviction for perjury and misleading Congress. Look, I believe that there are certainly instances where American troops should go in, and if the troops that are in Bosnia are in there for a defined purpose, they are in there for a defined period of time, and there is a clear and unambiguous exit strategy, reluctantly, I would support that. But I'm not speaking for the Christian Coalition. I want to make it clear because we didn't take a position on that. But I guess my question would be, why did we stand idly by for 36 months while innocent women and children were slaughtered by Serb militias that were armed to the teeth, while we took a policy that did not even allow them to defend themselves? I think that was wrong, and I think we're paying the price for it today.
Okay, my second question, and just in quick response to your question.
I wonder if we could give the person behind you a chance for a question. We're out of time, actually. Do you mind?
I'll make it real quick.
Yeah.
I suppose I understand the connection between evangelical values and societal morality, and I very much appreciate the fact that you brought up the historical relevance of the reform movements of the 1830s, especially around prison reform, temperance, treatment towards the mentally
What's one of
ill,
your slow questions
public
look like?
education. My question is, though, I'm not clear on the connection between the Christian Coalition's belief in the capitalistic system and the glorification of material values and Christ's teachings about loving thy neighbor. And my question is, how do you reconcile the two of those, a 15% tax cut versus giving resources to helping our poorest neighbors who are in dire need? Thank you.
Well, first of all, as I think we've made it clear, in the area of our opposition to legalized gambling, in the area of our opposition to seductive advertising by alcohol and tobacco companies directed at our children, enticing them to use products that would destroy their bodies and ravage their souls, that we are not unqualified or unapologetic defenders of every aspect of capitalism. Certainly, there are aspects of capitalism that are distasteful. The worship of profit over people, the fact that sometimes material wealth becomes subsumed over a more morally healthful society. And in fact, I not only thought my remarks tonight were not an unapologetic defense of capitalism, but were the very opposite. I made the point that there were other things that we had to do. But I will say about capitalism what Winston Churchill said about democracy. It's the worst system that has ever been conceived by the mind of man, except for all the rest. If you can find a better system that will create more jobs, that will create more wealth, that will create more opportunity, and that will unleash the liberty not only of the mind and the genius, but the spirit of man, then pursue it. But I think the record of socialist regimes and communist regimes is very clear. It has rationed inequality and has rationed economic privation, whereas capitalism has created wealth beyond anything that we would have ever dreamed. It is not perfect. It clearly needs to have policies that correct those aspects that we disagree with, but I don't believe that there's ever been a system that's been conceived that's better.
Okay, this has to be the last question. I'm sorry.
Well,
Ma'am.
it's actually a bit of a follow-up to that. I've heard you profess deep concern about poverty this evening, but at the same time tout the Dow's rise to 600 as a sign of great economic prosperity and potential. And you've mentioned your support for this 15% across-the-board tax cut, but the reality is that tax problems are not being felt across the board. The share of our taxes paid by giant corporations and the rich has plummeted. Suffering, more and more people are suffering because of massive upward redistribution of wealth in this country to giant corporations and the few individuals who are controlling them. So, and that's what the Dow Jones rise to 6,000 is. So where in Christian doctrine is unbridled greed held up as an ideal, and why are you shilling for corporate interests against the public interest?
Well, Let me just correct a misstatement of fact. I personally support a 15% tax cut. The Christian Coalition has not taken a position on an across-the-board rate reduction. What we have made the centerpiece of our agenda on Capitol Hill is a $500 per child tax credit for families with children. By the way, for families with children making less than $75,000 a year. I hardly think that's a subsidy for corporate greed. I think what it is a subsidy for overtaxed, overburdened, overregulated families. And not only is it something that I support, but it's something that Bill Clinton claims that he supports. I think the bigger issue for liberals is not why are we in favor of tax cuts. Because at a time that, as I said, the average family of four is spending 35 to 40% of its income on taxes, it used to take one income to easily support a family. Now it takes two incomes just to get by, and one of those wage earners, by the way, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, earns only 28% of that household's income. Only earns 28% of that household's income, which means what? Which means that second wage earner is earning enough to pay for a wardrobe, lunch, child care, daycare, and taxes. That's all they're working for. Now, you may think that that's an equitable system. I don't. I think we ought to reduce the crushing tax burden on the American family. I think the other question is this. If we believe so much in truth and veracity and truth in advertising, Bill Clinton ran in 1992 promising a tax cut for middle-class families with children. It was the centerpiece of his putting people first agenda. He said he would either lower the tax rates on families with children or he would provide a $500 to $1,000 child tax credit for those families. And you may remember that in the New Hampshire primary, and I'm sure here in Massachusetts as well, there was a pitched battle between he and Paul Tsongas over whether or not that was free candy, free goodies. You remember he was called Santa Claus, and he got up and said over and over again that if he was elected president, he would provide that tax cut. He became president of the United States. He not only didn't pass the tax cut, he never even proposed it. Instead, he passed the largest tax increase in American history, and I think we need a president who keeps his promises, and I think we need a president who, when he says he's going to cut taxes, he at least sends the bill to Capitol Hill. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. My thanks to the audience and to the speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Reed. Thank you.
Thank you.